Hi everyone, I wanted to go over our homework that was due on Sunday. The prompt asked you to make 2 pages, one that used fixed positioning and the one that used fluid layout. So if you remember from the layout chapter reading and lecture 14, a fixed layout doesn't change size as the user increases or decreases the size of their browser window. And then for fixed layouts, you normally see a lot of box sizing set in pixels, whereas with fluid layouts, you'll normally see percentages. So if we look at my website here, this is a fluid layout. So you can see the text gets a smaller width as I move this in. All right, so we're going to get started back on Dablet, and we're going to start out on the fixed layout. So if we look at this picture again, scroll down, it looks like this is the whole browser window here, but the application is in this fixed amount inside the body. So this whole thing would be the body because that's what displays in the browser. It looks like we have a block level header, some kind of sidebar here, a main content, and then the footer. So when I start something like this, I like to make all these block elements first. So I might start with the header. If we're using the new HTML5 elements that we've learned about, then we use header instead of a div. Looked like there was an H1 in there, so this is my header content. All right, what's next? Below that, it looks like we have the sidebar and the main content. So these two items are floated, but this whole block here, this whole content, could be one big div. So I like to keep my floated elements inside a container so that the footer doesn't try to come up next to the floated content or anything. So if I'm doing my full width block elements first, I might have some kind of div that holds both of those in there. So TBD, this will have the sidebar main content. Okay, and then finally we had that footer. And sometimes when I want to see what all of this looks like, let me actually add some content in there. I'll put borders around everything. So we want to style that header, maybe border solid 2 pixels red, and then we have this div, border solid 2 pixels green, and then we have a footer, 2 pixels orange. Okay, so when I look up here now, you can see the blocks. You can see the boxes that are making up my layout. So this is kind of like what I do first before I float any content or anything like that. I try to have these full level containers like this. So if I go back to here, this doesn't take up the full width of the browser like my example is. So if I go back here, this is touching the left hand side all the way to the right hand side, which is not what we want here. It looks like there's a fixed width on this, so I'll have to set that up. So this whole thing is going to be set at a fixed width and centered in the browser. So you have one side here, maybe one side here. So in order to do that, there are 2 approaches. The first one is that you can add styling to each one of these things and set them like a max width. So if I did max width here, maybe we'll do some number like 800 pixels, and then I'll copy and paste this, do it to the div, and I'll do it to the footer. They're still not centered, so if you remember the trick we learned in a previous video, you can do margin 0, auto. You can do that down here too. So this is one way of doing it. You can see it's all centered like that now, but there's actually a much quicker and easier way, which I'm going to do instead. But I wanted you to see both. So you can take all of your content and put this container around it. And then you can just add the styling to here. So now that we have two divs, we've got to use some classes. So maybe there's a common convention where you could name this wrapper, and then up here in your CSS, add a new wrapper selector with some styles, and now you can do that margin 0 auto. We'll do width 900 pixels. We'll do 900. Okay, so pretty much the exact same effect, but now it's done in one place, which is nice. So we have one more issue. We have this style applied to this div, and since we have this other div, it's putting a green border around everything. We don't want that, so we have to be a little more specific about which div this is. So you can name this pretty much whatever you want, but you want it to make sense. So this is kind of the content area, so I can name this one content. And then in my CSS, I can change that to content. So now we have our div set up. So this is the way to get that basic styling set up, like your basic layout before moving into your floated stuff. All right, so we can start in on that next. So we have that sidebar on the left-hand side. You can use a div for this, or you could use one of our HTML elements like an aside. You could use the nav, whatever makes most sense for your website. If it's going to be full of navigation items, you might want to call it nav. In my case, I'm going to use aside, which by default is a block level element. So it's going to act just like a div. And then maybe for my other section, I can use the main element, which again is just a div, a more semantic div, and then some content here. So none of these are floated at the moment, so they're all just going to show up in line like this. So as a better way to see what this content is, I can go ahead and put in some background colors. So let's do that. In my example, I think the background color was green. So now I don't really need this border anymore because I can see it easily with the header. Content, and then I think the footer, I think that was light blue. Okay. I think we had the aside, that sidebar piece was, so I've been writing background because it's a shortcut, but you could also do background color. Oh, what color did I have that? Light gray. Okay. And then the main was my go-to, tomato. I got a border here somewhere. Yeah, we don't need that border on there because we got all the content. I guess we could leave it for now. All right, so one thing I still have to do is put some actual content in here. So I actually have 3 paragraphs that I already made up just to copy and paste in here. 3 paragraphs of lorem ipsum. So this would be whatever content you want it to be, but get that formatted correctly. My main ending tag went somewhere. Did I not have a main? Hold on. There it is. So there's my starting one. Now here's my ending one, and I'll get these lined up. Cool. All right, so now I got some content in there. So now we can start to think about floating. So I want this sidebar thingy to go to the left, and I want this to go to the right. So this whole wrapper is 900 pixels wide. So if I want my aside to maybe take up a third of that, I could do width 300 pixels. And I'm using pixels because I'm doing a fixed layout here. And then for my main, we could do width 600 pixels. Okay. And then we want the aside to be on the left, and we want this main thing to go up on the right. So if you remember our float, so there are actually two ways of doing this. You could use absolute positioning to move this main content to the right, or you could just do a float. Float's probably a little easier. Okay, so I got that there. And then I'll put this one on the right. Okay, so things are looking a little weird right now. One thing I want to do is get rid of that border. Just comment it out for now. Oops. Okay. So we have our sidebar here, and now on the right hand side we have our content. This footer though is still trying to float up here, and this is happening because both of these are floated, so it thinks that the height of the or this one is floated, so it's coming up right under it here. So our fix for this is this content is the container div for these two floated elements, so we can add something here called overflow auto. And what that does is it gives this height back to the container div. So I'll comment this out again. I think I showed you this on a previous video, but I'll just run through it real quick again. So if I look at this height of this content div, even though it's got both of these divs inside there, it's showing a height of 0. And that's because both of the elements in there are floated. So it doesn't automatically give it a height. It's just a weird CSS thing. And you can get around that by doing overflow auto on the container div. So now if I go over here, you can see that it shows that there's a height of 468. All right. So the next thing we want to do is we don't have any height set on these, so we can do that. Maybe do a height of 500 pixels. Try that. And then we want these to match, so height of 500 pixels. Okay, so basic layout setup. I don't really like this white space here, so the browser adds a lot of that by default. I'm sure you're used to me saying that. I like to do something like margin 0, padding 0, and that takes out some of that default margin, so now you can see everything's kind of touching here. All right, so it looks pretty good. It's a fixed layout, which means when I do this, see how it doesn't scale? This is how a lot of the original websites were made, and it does not work well with mobile, so we're really trying to get away from this and use more fluid layouts. And this concept called responsive web design that we're going to go over in a little bit. But yeah, this is a fixed website layout. And we can do a few more improvements. So this is up against the border, which remember we don't like, so I'm going to set some padding. Try 12 pixels, so now we've got a little more space there. And then we can do the same thing with this aside. You'll see something interesting happen here. Here, I'm going to do these as 10s, so the math is easier. So let's do 10 pixels there. Okay, so something happened. So our 10 pixels showed up, but the content went down. It no longer fits on that line. And this is because when you set the height of a div like this, or in our case an aside, a block level element, by default that width is going to be just for the content. And so when you add a padding on it, now you have the padding, which is 10 pixels here, the width of the content, which is 500 pixels, and then you also would have, here, let me get it up. You can see the green bit now right there. Now you have 10 pixels on the other side. That's also part of that padding. So instead of having a width of 600 pixels, now you have a width of 620 pixels because it's adding on both of those side gutters of 10 pixels. So when you have 620 pixels plus the main, or I'm sorry, 320 pixels. This is the 300 pixel wide one. 320 pixels plus 600 pixels, that's 920 pixels. So it's trying to put 920 pixels wide worth of content inside a wrapper that is only allowing for 900 pixels. So if we were to do padding on the main element as well, I'll add it here, we'll do the same thing, 10 pixels. So now this one has a little bit of padding here, but there's this much of an overlap, so it can no longer fit in that space. So there are two ways of fixing this. The first one is just to take into account the fact that you've added 20 pixels total, 10 pixels on each side, and just make this width, like subtract it from this, so it would be 280. And then you'd have to do the same thing down here. This would be 580 pixels. All right, so now they'll fit up there again. So that's one way of doing it. It involves math, so I try to avoid doing that one. Take this back out. Put these back at 300 pixels. The other way, if you remember, I think it was lecture 14. Let's see if I can find it. Box sizing. We talked about how by default it sets it to content box, where when you set the width of an element, it's only the content, but you can change this to be border box, so the padding and the border are included in your width. This is a really good way of doing this. So I'll go into my CSS here. That was a bad copy and paste. Just get this cleaned up. All right, so now you can see it all fits again, even though I don't have these set to 280 and 580. And that's because I changed it from content box to border box, which means that when I set this as 300 pixels, it will make the content smaller, have a smaller width to account for those extra pixels. So if I highlight over it now, it's saying the width is 280 instead of 300. And again, still fixed. So if I want to finish this out, I can just put some padding on the footer for consistency. And there we go, fixed layout. And so now I want to jump into the fluid layout. So I'm going to get rid of this CSS down here. All right, so we're back to this. I'll leave all this stuff up here just because it'll be useful, but you could in theory do it without. Make this a little less assuming. All right, so now we're going to get started on a fluid layout. And a fluid layout is actually what this is by default. See how when I move it, all the text is moving around. So if I don't write any CSS, you have a fluid layout. That's why, if you remember our discussion from a long time ago, like when I talked about how the web by default is really accessible and usable, and this would look great on mobile because it would already scale as it should. But when your sites get a little more complicated and you have layouts with components that sit next to each other, you have to do a little bit more work to get this same kind of layout. All right, so first things first, I'll get some of this styling back in here. We're now making a fluid layout or liquid layout. Come on, formatting. Background green. If you don't mind, stop doing that. Okay, and then we had the aside. Background light gray. We have main, background, tomato, butter, background light blue. Alright, so we got our basic stuff set up. Now we can start thinking about getting some of these floats lined up. So before, what we did was we set a width to 300 pixels because this whole thing was 900 pixels. For now, I'm going to set this as a percentage because that'll let it scale. So if you remember, by default, the content will take up 100% width, which is how, like, when you make this smaller, it's still taking up 100%. It's just a smaller screen to take that percentage of. So if I do width, we'll do 30%. Now it's going to take up 30% of the screen. So if I make it smaller, you see it's getting smaller as well. It's still scaling in that way. It's still 30% of the screen, but it's adjustable. That's what we mean by fluid. And so if I go to main, we have that first one is 30%. So this one we can do 60%. Okay, so it's 60%. When I do this, it's still 60%. It's just scaling. Still got to do our float. Get your float over there. Float this one to the right. Okay, so now those are set up. Got a bit of overflow in there. And this is going to make our footer move down. So there goes our footer. And I can't do math. There we go. Now they're all touching again. Alright, I got a number of questions about how to set heights, so I wanted to cover some of those. One of the questions was, what elements can you or should you set heights for? This really depends on your design and how you want it to look. So you can set a height on pretty much any element that isn't displayed in line. So if you remember, like if something isn't a strong tag or an EM tag in the middle of a paragraph, those are in line, so you can't set a height and have it appear. So I would say only do it if you need to, because the default height is set to auto, which means that it's just gonna fit all the content inside of it, and it'll take the height of whatever it needs to display that content. So if you look at this example here, I don't have a height set, so it's gonna take up the content here, and this is technically fine if that's what you want your design to look like. If I wanted it to be something specific, you could set an actual height. Maybe I wanted it to be 500 pixels tall, or maybe I want it to be 200. You know, it's kind of arbitrary. It's pretty hard with the stuff that you know right now to get it to just automatically match this side. We're going to learn something today called Flexbox that handles that for you, and that'll make these layouts a little bit easier. So another thing you could do, say you don't want this 200 pixels. Actually, one note on that real quick. If I change this around, it's still a flexible design in that this stuff is still scaling as it should. But what might happen is if you have a bunch of content in here, that it gets, like this stuff in the sidebar would go past that 200 pixels. So here, I'll actually make this, we'll try maybe 100 pixels. No, that's not gonna be enough. 50 pixels, okay. And then when I make this smaller, see how the content is going out of it? So one thing I can do here is set a min height of 50 pixels. That way it never gets smaller than that. But if you do this, see, now it's bigger than that. So that's one thing you could do. If you don't want to use pixels, say you want to use percentages, there is a way of doing that. It's a little convoluted, and again, Flexbox will handle a lot of this, but just like you can set width to percentages, you can set the height, and this is not going to do what you want at first glance. So I set a height to 100%. nothing changed here. But when you think about it, what are you setting it 100% to? So when you use percentages on heights and widths of block elements, they do it in relation to their container. So aside, the container, if we go to the HTML here, here's aside, its container is this div of content. And so it's going to set the aside's height to 100% of the height of the content. But the height property on the content is not set. So by default, height is set to auto, and so 100% of auto, the browser won't set that. So one thing you could do is set the height of content. So if I go up here, and I'll set this to 100, and still you can see it didn't change here. So now you might be thinking, okay, its aside is set to 100% of content. Content's height is set to 100% of what? Go up here. What's the parent of this one? Wrapper. Wrapper doesn't have a height set. Warper. No change up there. So what is the parent of wrapper? So Dablet, it just lets you type everything between the body tags, and it fills in the rest of it. So technically there's a body tag and everything else surrounding this. So the next one up would be the body. The body by default doesn't have a height set on it. You can kind of see a trend going now. Still no change. So what's surrounding body? That would be the HTML element. And now we see it change. So you had to set the height of all of these explicitly in order to get this to show up. So right now this height is talking about, or it's configurable for the actual height of the screen here. So it's gonna not go the whole way down to here, but it'll include like from whatever the height is from here to here, that's going to be set to this. So it's a little confusing, and this probably isn't the easiest way to do this. So I'll show you another one. Somebody asked about using the unit VH and VW. So VH and VW stand for viewport height and viewport width, I believe, and they're a responsive unit that lets you set it based on the actual viewport here instead of just percentages. So I'll take these two out, and I'll take this out. Okay, did I get them all? I'll take this height out, and I'll take this height out. Alright, so if I want this aside to take up the 100% of the viewport, you could do something like VH, or height 100 VH, and think of these almost like percentages in that they go 0 to 100 for the max. They can also, obviously, that's 200% of the viewport. But now what this does is pretty much the exact same thing as the percentage. The difference is when you set a percentage on an element, it sets it to the percentage of its parent. So it's kind of relative to the container that it's in. So if the whole parent was 50% and you set the height of the child to 100%, it would still only show 50% of the container's height instead of 50% of the entire browser window. And that's a little confusing, but just remember that percentages are relative to the parent, whereas these VH and VW units are relative to the actual viewport. So you're going to get the same result in this case. You see this little bit of padding here, and you still have to scroll a little bit. If you wanted this to go exactly to the bottom, you'd have to use these viewport height widths or heights for the header and the footer as well. So if we looked at the header, say we wanted this height to be 5 VH. Nope, that's not enough. 15 VH. So now this is going to be, I guess, 15% of the whole viewport height here. And now you want to do this next part also as VH, but you have to subtract 15 from it in order to get it to display there. So 100 minus 15 85 VH. Alright, so now it goes to right there. You can see that white changes exactly where it should there. And then you could also do, if you wanted the footer in there, maybe you want your footer set as a height of, we'll do 10 VH. So now it's 10% of the viewport height. Just to make an example, I'm going to take out this main section for just a sec. Okay. You still can't see the footer though, and that's because this is still not taking into consideration that you added this 10 here. So if I go to the aside and make this 75, so I'm taking 85 minus the 10 for the footer. There. Now it's perfectly, I'm scrolling, you can't tell, but it's perfectly set to be 100% of this viewport here. If this whole section, like maybe the footer came up to here, like this whole line, I don't think I can drag it, no, but it would be relative to this height here. So that's one way of doing things. It gets a little complicated when you have the other content back in here. So if I put this back in, oops. The footer's still going to go where it should. Yeah, so change this back to, oops, change this back to 85. Now if I scroll, this sidebar takes up the whole height here. So that's another way you could do it. Let me see what other questions you had. When is setting the height necessary? Someone asked that. Again, I kind of answered this already, but it just depends on your design. So if I didn't have this light gray here, it was just white, and like if I didn't have a footer here, I wouldn't really need to set a height at all, because you can't really tell where it ends. So here it's fine to just leave it on auto. It's when you have backgrounds like this in that you might want it to display in a certain way. Covered VHs, somebody asked about that. Yeah, so that's, I think, a good overview for starting on how to set heights. Just remember it depends on your design. So when you figure out, when you're setting your page layout up, think about whether you want that sidebar to be displayed all the way to the bottom, or if you want it to display something like this where it only shows up the content. And this is a non-issue if you don't even have a background set. So yeah, it kind of all depends on the design. So hopefully that answers a few of your questions.